Welcome to the Does Anything Matter podcast, where Patrick and Pepin talk about the most age-old question of does anything actually matter? Welcome to the damn podcast. This is your host Pepin, and I'm joined by my co-host Patrick. How you doing, Patrick?
Awesome. Glad to be here, as always. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I woke up extremely tired today, but I've slightly woken up ever since like 2 p.m. today. So, hey, there's that. Lots of caffeine.
Oh, yeah. Well, I worked all day, so you and your 2 o'clock.
Yeah, it sucks.
Jeez.
Well, I have to work till 12
Yeah.
a.m., so, there's that too.
When do you think we'll start doing these things in person again? It's a little bit strange getting on here every couple of weeks.
I was honestly hoping soon because, I depending on what source you read, it's either getting worse or it's getting better or, so on and so forth. So, I don't know. It depends on your comfortability, my comfortability. I know that you have a daughter. I have type 1 diabetes. But then again, I'm not too much concerned right now. My health is pretty well in check, besides my sleep.
It's pretty tough times out there. I mean, if anybody's watching and you're feeling a little bit down about this situation, just remember we're all going through the same thing. So we're doing our best to try and create some level of normalcy here. So just hang in there.
Right. Now, the topic we have today is a topic that is kind of interesting because I think there's this idea out there that if you're a jerk, you're bad. But then sometimes, it's okay to be a jerk, I think, because every once in a while the circumstance might fit that. I mean, is there ever a bad time to not be a jerk? Or is there ever a time where it's wrong to be a jerk? I don't know, because I think there's times that people are justified in their anger or outrage. And maybe it's, circumstantial and context dependent, but, just like a brief overview. Like, what are your thoughts on that in general, Patrick?
I think that jerk is subjective. I mean, just like any other adjective that you can call somebody, what you would consider somebody being a jerk might be different than what I consider somebody being a jerk. And so it's really hard to say. I think first we have to kind of define what overall society considers to be a jerk, right? And some of the qualities that I've heard that are associated with jerks are people who are pushy, people who are selfish, and they put their needs above other people's. Maybe they're just generally inconsiderate. Am I missing any qualities there?
Yeah, I think part of it is, okay, so maybe this way I'd put it, like, being a jerk is kind of like being rude unprovoked, right? Because it's kind of like got this quality of rudeness to it where you are acting in a way that is unbecoming or acting kind of like an aggressive way towards somebody, but it's not for any particular well-justified reason. So I think that's where the subjective aspect comes in, because what's justified as far as being the jerk portion, because you could talk about someone who's maybe being rude to someone and that's like an objective criteria, but whether that rudeness was deserved or not, that's the question of whether you're a jerk or not, because I think the jerk portion is like the subjective criteria.
But do you think that maybe the word jerk is overused? Because I think a lot of times rude and jerk are interchangeable. Because you say that to be a jerk, it has to be unprovoked. I don't think that's necessarily a common opinion. I mean, if somebody says something to me that I think is stupid and I point it out, it's not unprovoked because they said something really stupid. So me saying it was provoked by them saying something stupid. It's just that their perception of what I said was that I was a jerk.
Okay, so in your example there, like, from your perspective, are you being a jerk?
Probably, because I don't have to respond that way. I mean, I probably would if we're being honest, but I don't have to. Somebody says something stupid to me, I could choose to ignore it, or I could respond in a more productive way. I don't have to point out that what they're saying is stupid to progress the conversation.
All right. Well, see, I could see that on like a needless basis, right? Because sometimes like people just like raining on other people's parades. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not into astrology at all. And I could go on, or is it astrology? That's the fake one. Not astronomy, which is the sciencey one. But I'm not into astrology. I think it's pretty stupid, to be honest. But a lot of people believe in it, and sometimes people talk about it. But usually, I bite my tongue and I just kind of like let them talk about it. Because if I just come in there and start, giving, I mean, I would say facts. Sounds a little pretentious, but if I start kind of arguing with them about their position, it kind of makes me look like number one, a party pooper, but number two, kind of a jerk, because I'm just coming in there just to ruin their predictions or their fortunes or whatever you want to call it.
That's basically just based on the context. Because if you were in a laboratory or a science classroom and people were talking about astrology, but they were using it to try and make legitimate scientific predictions, then you wouldn't be a jerk for refuting that. You'd be doing your job, right? You're only being a jerk because the context of the situation is just a casual conversation. And it's just people who want something fun to talk about usually. Maybe there are people that really believe it, but their belief in it is really just more of a personal spiritual thing, and it's not really meant to be life altering for other people. Does that make sense?
I think so. So you could so you could say in the context of a classroom or the context of like a teaching job, you're kind of meant to correct, say, certain thoughts and certain, say, paradigms of, belief, right? So if someone's talking about the planets kind of affecting your, of course, the planets are affecting your future, but kind of affecting in some sort of menial way if it's affecting your temperament. I mean, you could say maybe technically it is because it's self-enforcing your belief, and that's how belief interplays with reality and so on. But it's not actually doing anything. Okay, if you didn't have that belief that these planets were affecting anything, it wouldn't affect you at all. Like you wouldn't even know. And so I think if your position of the teacher, yes, you should say, if someone's saying, astrology is logical or say it makes sense, it would make sense for that teacher to come in. But then if you're just talking and say in the context of, let's say you overhear like a conversation, like at you're at McDonald's, and then you see this kind of couple kind of talking about their astrological signs and everything, and you just kind of pop in that conversation. I mean, number one, it's kind of rude because you're kind of butting into a conversation that's not your own personal one. I mean, it might make sense if they're about to like take some drug that they don't realize is going to kill them, but it's another thing if it's just about some stupid conversation. And kind of butting in, number one, you're a jerk for butting in a conversation for something that is just self-aggrandizing to yourself, or just trying to like show your moral, intellectual superiority. But also, you're kind of being a jerk because you didn't have to rain on the parade, or you didn't have to like start correcting them for no good reason.
It's true. But so going back to my example of somebody says something stupid, right? Now, if it's something harmless and stupid, then I'm probably a jerk for pointing it out, right?
Mhm.
But let's say that it's something that is actually really harmful and also stupid. So maybe the reason why I say something so aggressively is because I want to drive home that point. Especially, let's say I'm in a position of authority, right? The word jerk is often used to describe bosses. I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that have said their boss is a jerk before,
Mhm.
right? But if you do something that could be potentially a conflict for the company or dangerous for employees or for customers, then I'm probably going to be aggressive about it because I want the person to understand that what they're doing isn't okay. But a lot of people attribute that to being a jerk because you're being aggressive.
Mhm.
But that's not always true. This is what I mean by the context. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Right. Right. I mean, there's also the meta level because, like, uh, both of us have been bosses before. So, and I think you're currently a boss. So, we have this kind of understanding that if one of our high ups is doing something, they might be acting in a way which is a jerk. But let's say our former boss that we had together, the way that she would act whenever she say gave like a write up or anything, like you kind of got the impression she didn't want to do it herself. It's like her hand was kind of forced, or she was just kind of like, this is the way I'm supposed to do my job. What else am I supposed to do? And you couldn't really blame her for what she did. It's just kind of like, yeah, makes sense. So some people might consider her a jerk in that kind of sense, in that, oh, I can't believe she's writing me up. She should let me off the hook. She knows I meant well, or this and that. But from my point of view, she's always just doing her job, and I think that does bring the context in there. Like you can act, say, in a way that might be a little bit cold and standoffish, but if you have the understanding behind it, it's not really jerky behavior.
But like, do you think that you're doing somebody a disservice if you are not aggressive towards them? And I just can't think of a better word. I'm sure there's a better word than aggressive, but what I mean is if you're not driving home the point to them and you're really showing them the importance of it, like let's say that you're the manager that just says, I don't really believe I should write you up, but this is what the company wants, so I'm going to do it. That person is most likely not going to take the advice as seriously as if you believed what you were saying, right? You actually come down on them for what it is. As a leader, you don't have to personally believe in everything that is is sort of being pushed by the company, but it's also your job to champion the culture. So even if you don't 100% believe in it, you're not supposed to show people that, right? So some people might perceive that you're being a jerk about something that seems unreasonable, but if that person wants to advance in their career, then they're going to have to at some point drink the Kool-Aid, right? So just in this specific example about work, it's sort of a disservice to somebody to just consistently pass the buck and say, this is just the way the river flows. There's not really anything we can do about it. I don't believe in it, but this is what it is, essentially. Do you agree or disagree?
I feel like the point you're trying to make, and I'm trying to condense this down, is that sometimes there's two different points. One is that sometimes you actually have to be a jerk if you're trying to affect change, or to make that kind of imprint, like, you have to show that there's teeth, right? Because if there's not teeth behind that, then, they're not going to take you seriously in that change. The other thing is that you kind of have to buy into the fact that you are being aggressive towards them, because if you don't, then they're going to kind of see that you're not actually serious about, what you're trying to affect. Like, there was a recent video I watched of, I don't know anything about this case, but it's a really, really weird one where it's like, there's this, what do you call it? Investigation or deposition where Roger Stone's getting deposed. His big name, I think, but I don't know anything about the case. But he was acting in a way that was just very, very odd, because he was being very rude, but also had these like weird smiles and little things happening. And he had come going. He's trying to like act really composed. He was just breaking into pressure. He was acting really rude. And he's trying to put all these different things out, and it didn't end up working for him. But from the point of view I was seeing, he was acting as a jerk in a way to kind of affect the other person. Now, he did it very poorly because he couldn't keep his composure, but in that sense, a lot of lawyers will kind of use that kind of strategy of acting like tough and like a jerk, and like, to try to get the opposition off kilter and kind of back off. So I can see it as being an effective strategy, and I feel like it could be employed, say, strategically, but also I think maybe you have to embody that role a bit to really kind of know. Because in this case, he was putting on the act, and number one, he was breaking his composure, so you could obviously see through it. But even then, his act wasn't very good, so the opposing lawyer could just keep pushing because he knew that this thing was a facade.
That's a good point. And so sometimes you have to do it because in a way you're providing a service to the other person. But then in the example that you're talking about, it can also be a strategy in instances where, let's say, it's hard to get someone to take you seriously. This is especially true in situations where, like, say that you're a young boss and you're dealing with a lot of people that are your age. It can be difficult if they perceive you as a friend or as a peer, right? So sometimes being a jerk, quote unquote, because again, this is a subjective term, but acting like a jerk can be a strategy that can kind of differentiate you from a peer and make people view you as more of a boss. Now, whether that's good or bad is a whole other discussion, but it's definitely a legitimate strategy to separate yourself from the pack. But okay, so sort of moving away from work, here's another scenario. What do you think about this? Like being a parent, is there some application for being a jerk there?
In regard to who? Your children, or your people interacting with your children?
Both. I mean, I would say starting with discipline in general. Now, whether a kid's always going to perceive you as a jerk, right? I mean, not always, but a good portion of the time, especially as they get older, they're going to say that you're a jerk if they can't do what they want to do. And sometimes they don't listen, right? You try other tactics. You don't start off by being a jerk, but sometimes you have to be, because kids don't understand the implications of their actions. So this goes back to what I was saying before about doing a service, right? Because if you don't drive home the point with that extra layer of aggression, then it might not be understood. And what you don't want is for your kid to do something that can get them into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
I'd say so, because, well, it kind of goes back to the point about inflicting a little bit of pain to kind of make your point heard. Like, you try to make your point heard without pain, but if you can't do it, then you have to, get a little Pavlov like a Pavlovian dog on them. Like you have to enforce some pain to get them to really kind of take it seriously. At my current job, or actually, we've seen this at our past job too, or my past job, where sometimes parents will do things that will kind of screw over their kids to take them seriously. So one instance is it's like every once in a while to be parents who would be on their children's accounts, and then if their child is really acting up, they'd take the money out of their account. I mean, it didn't happen too much, but happened occasionally. Uh, at the place I currently work, which is an ISP, every once in a while we get parents that will call in and they'll want to shut off their internet for the night because their kids aren't listening and they won't get off the Xbox.
Too funny. And that's also horrible. I remember when I was a kid, I had video games taken away, and that was definitely the worst punishment ever. But the the thing is, though, I was smarter than my parents. I would walk to the bus stop, or they would drop me off at the bus stop, but I knew what time they went to work. So I would just leave the bus stop and just like wait in the park. And then when they went to work, I would walk home and just play video games all day.
Well, okay.
So I guess in that case, being a jerk didn't work. So just to kind of clarify too, I mean, I don't really have a solid position on this. Most issues I do, but I'm just kind of putting ideas out there. And I think there's also an argument counter to what I just brought up a minute ago, which is that as the parent, being a jerk doesn't work. There's a lot of people that say that punishment is just a way that to get kids to rebel. That there isn't actually any reinforcement involved in it at all. And that sort of positive actions are more productive for kids. I don't know if I believe that, but have you heard anything like that?
So I am a big fan of that sort of stuff, to be honest. And I think there's something to be said that punishing, parenting with punishment, or say punishment to some effect or some degree, can still be effective. So I'm not saying it's not going to work. I mean, there's plenty of experiments done with animals showing, say, Pavlovian conditioning and other types of conditioning too. So obviously there are effects there. But I think the biggest issue with children is long term, because when you are trying to, let's say, train or enculture a child, you have to look long term, because the tricks you use on, say, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or, say, even a 5-year-old are probably not going to work on them when they get older and smarter. And they're going to learn your ways, and they're going to learn you better than on some level. So I think that using reason and discourse is far better, but it's also a far harder proposition, because you argue with anybody in the street and try to get them to change their mind and kind of change their positions. That's hard enough. Do it to someone who's not even capable of reasoning on that level to a decent extent. It's hard to kind of get that through. But I think that it's kind of like planting a tree. If you start early and kind of keep consistent with it, then you can reap later benefits, say when they're, say, going through their teens and so on and so forth. Now, again, it's not an easy strategy, and the issue with it is that it's also a strategy which is, say, culpable of being not exploited, but being forwarded by other people. Because let's say that you have your parenting style or your style of parenting, and then let's say that they go to grandma's house and the grandma treats them in a way that's completely different. That's gonna kind of cause some confusion. And I think there should be carryover in general, but especially just, let's say, person A and person B are split, and person A is, this happens a lot of times. A lot of times you have the father who's more like rules based and they kind of are strict, and then you have the mother who is very give them lots of candy and sweets and let them do whatever they want. So there's this weird dichotomy they get between I'll just call it the patriarchy and the matriarchy, stereotypically. And so they get very unstructured in their sense. And I think, the, say, not overbearing, I think the more rational and kind of speaking way could and would be more helpful in the long term, but you can get really fucked up if it's applied, if there's some other person applying the opposite strategy on the other end, because the issue is the kids don't want the opposite strategy. They want to be pampered. They want ease. They want what they want right now. And if you give that, or if someone gives that to them and they get used to it, they're going to get used to it very quickly.
It's true. I think really inconsistency is going to hurt no matter what, because if you go the discipline strategy and you're constantly a jerk, then as soon as somebody else is nice to them, then it's going to undermine your efforts, right? Because essentially being a jerk is kind of leading with fear,
Mhm.
and not being a jerk, going the more diplomatic route is kind of leading with respect, right? So respect and fear sometimes go together, but other times they're at odds. So I think either way, you're going to have that dichotomy somewhere. Now, you brought up an interesting thing, though, which is the typical stereotype between the patriarch and the matriarch, right? So, how does being a jerk apply to men and women? Because I think that as far as society depicts it, there's a difference. Now, do I personally have this view? I don't think so, but there's definitely issues around this. Like, for instance, certain behaviors that men do are not always considered the man that is not it is, the man's not always considered to be being a jerk doing these things, but I would say that more often the woman is. Like, for example, being assertive or aggressive at work. Now, this has changed a little bit in recent years, but it's still a relatively prevalent thing where women who act more assertive, ambitious, and aggressive at work are considered a jerk. And a lot of times when men do this, it's just considered being successful. Like, what do you think about this comparison?
I'm never certain about it because it's not something I've seen in my life very much. Like the girls that tend to be called jerks tend to be called jerks because they're being jerks, and then same with the guys. I mean, it's. I'm not gonna say it doesn't exist because I can't say it doesn't because, but I just haven't really seen it in my life. But then again, the way I view people, like I don't know, there's been a lot of very strong female figures. I mean, not exactly in my life, but like have been my boss essentially. Like my previous boss at the last job, she's a very strong female figure, and I never saw her as a jerk. Very stern, very very open, very nice. But you didn't want to mess with her. Her boss, kind of in the same way, like very nice, but you kind of got the sense of like don't fuck with her because she will fuck you up. And it's not like I ever perceived her as being a jerk or being mean. It's just she was the boss, and then I've had previous bosses before that who they're very nice and but and very calm and assertive. So I don't know. I don't think I've really run into that. I've run into the Karens a lot, and I think the Karen, kind of the word that's been going around a lot. I've seen a lot of Karens, and Karens are definitely jerks. And there's also like a male version of a Karen that you see quite a bit too. But I again, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying that within my experience, I haven't really seen that. What I have seen is a lot of there's kind of this stereotype, and I think it's kind of true that men tend to not really care about each other, or we kind of like get a little bit like feisty with each other, and like we insult each other and stuff like that. But it's kind of like good fun until we bond. But girls tend to play a lot more in the backstabby, talk behind your back sort of thing. I see that, but I never see it like as the person's being a jerk. They think he's person A thinks person B's a jerk, and person B thinks person A's a jerk, and so on and so forth. I do this little like catfighty game, but I haven't really seen much as far as like bosses in that regard or that role. So I would want to ask what your experience or what your kind of you know observations have been, because mine's just been a little bit different, I think.
I think that you're just more of an open person, though. And I mean that in a good way. I mean, you have a very diverse acceptance of people. And I think that generally you're an inquisitive person. So when you look at people, you don't necessarily make those initial judgments because try you try to connect with people on in different ways. That's one of the reasons why we connected, because you have this very intellectual mind, and it's part of the reason why we're doing this show, right? So people like you and I aren't going to make those initial judgments because we kind of think beyond that, and that's not a cocky thing. We have we have flaws too. We're human, but
Mhm.
in that regard, I can say I'm the same way. I don't personally regard men and women to be different in that sense, but if you observe your peers, there's a clear line that's drawn there. And what I mean is that the way that men perceive women's actions are a lot different than the way that men perceive other men's actions.
Mhm.
So there, it's a lot more common that men don't want to be subordinate to women. So when women do things like when they have to be a jerk because maybe there's some insubordination going on, or maybe there's just an issue that is becoming untenable with an employee, then the woman is more often perceived to be a jerk for this than the man, right? With when it's two men dealing with each other and one has to be aggressive towards the other, again, there might be some posturing, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's less likely that that's going to result in a situation where there's resentment between the two. But I've seen this a lot in my working career, where you have high-powered women that are trying to manage subordinates, and both men and women. That's the thing. It's not only men against women. It's also that subordinate women don't like to be sort of dominated by other women. So it's just more difficult for women who are in power to command respect.
Mhm.
And it's nothing to do with what the woman's doing. It has to do with a perception of what makes someone a jerk. And because there are societal norms around what men and women ought to do, and women are perceived more to be nurturers. And again, this is something that's been changing in recent years, luckily. But historically, women have been considered to be nurturers, and a lot of people still have that feeling. So they think that when something's going wrong, a woman should be a more diplomatic, more participative, ask people for opinions, deliver bad news softly. But sometimes that's not the case. And so when a woman does something in a little bit more of a brash manner, maybe the way that you might expect a man to deliver it by typical standards, the woman is often called a jerk or
Mhm.
some variation of that. You've really never observed that?
Not really. Well, honestly, I think part of I have a bias towards favoring powerful women or women who are bosses and stuff, only because I've had experiences where kind of the opposite, where guys I've had guys bosses and they've kind of like talked to me or kind of giving me like these conversations, and those conversations I tend not to go very well. Like those same conversations with female bosses go pretty decent. Like, there's actually conversations kind of back and forth. It's not just like accusatory. But with a couple of male bosses I've had, it's like they sit you down and they just start like telling you how it is and don't give you a chance to explain your side. And it's just, it's more like the conversation is a means to the end, and they think they have all the facts. And it's kind of like just start, hamming it in. So I've always been more
But
frustrated with that style, because it's
one of the reasons why, and I'm not saying it wouldn't have always been this way, but it's interesting that you say that, because something that came up a lot in the classes I was taking in college, and I think this is true, I've observed this as well, is that when women are in power, they have to work a lot harder to do the same things that men do. And one of that one of the skills that they have to develop is that form of diplomacy, because they do encounter people that will not attribute their success the same way that they would with men. And so over time, this is getting better. But what's actually happening is that women are outpacing men in the workplace. And this is one of the ways in which they're doing it, is that women are beginning to surpass men in terms of people skills and leadership ability, because historically they've had to perform much better, because if a woman made a mistake or was perceived as a jerk, then it was taken significantly worse than if it were a man. And again, we live in a time that luckily there's not as much sexism as there once was, but there's that residual effect. So you have the fact that women just have gained so much more of this skill from having to do it, right? Just by virtue of being men, we go into leadership positions and some people respect us already. And you might not acknowledge this. I expect that you might disagree with me,
Mhm.
but there's definitely some residual effect of that. I've definitely felt it myself. I mean, there have literally been times when I've been at work and I've consciously understood that I've not really done a lot of work, but I've been given recognition for that. And every woman that I know that has been in a position of power is very good at her job. She's not mediocre, she's not average, but I've been average at my job many times and progressed. And so in this sense, I can recognize that as a man, it's much easier to progress. So you're going to see a lot more men that just aren't as good at that type of thing.
I would have to really see some data to really kind of know, because based off what I don't know, based off my experience, I've seen. I see the problem is I'm going off experience, right? And if my perception is skewed in a certain kind of way, where I see things a little bit differently, then I can't really argue against it necessarily, right? Because if you see one thing, I see something else. Who's right? Maybe my eyes need to be opened, or maybe I need to put on some different glasses, or take the glasses off. Like I'm not exactly certain. Uh, I do want to agree on some point, though, in that diplomacy is okay. I want to say two things. Number one, diplomacy is a good method of, say, it's a better method of leadership than, say, rule by fear. I think rule by fear can be effective in various circumstances, and you kind of want that. But it's like I've been going on a binge of like a history podcasts and kind of just listening about ancient leaders and great military generals, and the thing that tends to be, say, unanimous among most of them is that they're all very, very good at diplomacy. They're all very good about talking to people, talking to the men, building those bonds, and kind of not, of course, if someone like betrays them or something, they cut them down, but they're not like, they're able to be talked to. They're able to kind of do things. Like, of course, a lot of rule by fear has been there across humanity and history and everything. But I think diplomacy tends to be a better option. That's essentially what we have to do to raise armies and kind of keep things together. So I do think diplomacy is probably a better method, and I do think that a lot of times men may lean towards the aggressive side, kind of ruled by fear. I mean, for instance, there was this former boss I had, nice guy, but he wasn't quite 7 foot, but he was pretty close to 7 foot or something like that. He was pretty huge, maybe I think it's 6'10" actually, but this guy was just tall, and he had the kind of frame to match it, and he was the boss. And it's like I talked to him a little bit because I had a couple concerns. So I was kind of afraid to voice them with him because just natural kind of I don't know, monkey brain sort of things. You see a big guy, you're kind of scared of that big guy, and he started talking to me like, I'm actually nice, I'm easy to talk to. People see my size and they think that I'm a jerk. They think that I'm gonna be mean. You think that if you say one wrong thing, I'm gonna stomp on you or something. I'm not like that. So I think that there's an aspect there of number one, physicality having an effect on, say, your emotional behavior and reaction to people around you, because I think that can be the case. If someone is 7 foot, muscular and has a big strong voice, even without them being a jerk, people are going to kind of respect them more just because we're kind of programmed in that way to do it. But also I think that people who act in a way which is more aggressive will tend to get more things done. They'll tend to get things done faster, but I also don't think that strategy is stable, as you're alluding to. I think the diplomacy strategy is more stable in general. And the only other thing I will say is that there might be some perceived idea of added aggression just because of capability. Men, like, there's some stat out there which is the average man is stronger than the strongest female, which is oversimplifying a little bit, but men, fortunately, unfortunately, how do you want to view it, we're just stronger. So whenever you have a situation where you have man and woman, together, it's more than likely that man's going to be able to beat up that woman. And there's always that kind of disparity in, say, physical power, and that can manifest in some sort of perceptual aggression. Because if a man does something which is somewhat aggressive, it might be amplified as being super aggressive because there's the implication of, maybe not implication, but there's that kind of subtext or that kind of known fact that the man could do something. So it's something that people say, I'm going on a little tangent here, but that if you're a guy, that you want to be a little bit careful, especially if you're around, say, alone with a woman that you don't know, because if you act in a way that might be perceived as aggressive, that aggression might be, or that perceived aggression might be amplified, say, 10 times, because you are, let's say, take myself, I'm not like buff or anything, but I'm not like super skinny or something. I'm not like, it doesn't look like this, eat whey all day. So if I start acting aggressively, people might take that as a extreme signal of violence. That might be seen as really bad. I gave you a lot there.
like perception is one thing, and that's a component of what I'm talking about. And I don't know the statistics off the top of my head. The courses that I'm talking about where this was all discussed, I mean, I took these a year ago, but really the takeaway from them is that there's a pattern of sort of cultural indoctrination that men and women go through. And so perception is a component of it, like how I might perceive you and your level of aggression. But the other component of it is what we as men and what women as women perceive that their role is in society. And that's really subconscious. So when we're talking about being a jerk, what it is that when men go into the workforce, they are taught, whether it's intentional or subliminal, that they're supposed to be more aggressive. That men are providers, they're supposed to be outgoing, they're supposed to be maybe not aggressive, but definitely they're supposed to be more go-getters, more forward, right? And that you're supposed to say what's on your mind, and you're not supposed to be emotional. These are all sort of stereotypes that have been instilled in men, and it happens through the television that we see, it happens through the books we read, it happens through our education. And again, in our generation and the generations that follow us, this is not likely to be as prevalent because we've recognized this implicit bias, and we're sort of working to change it through different systems of education and through diversity programs and different things that we see on TV that might change that stereotype. But it's already embedded in our society, so there's a degree of it. And so what I mean is that if I have this sort of unconscious bias that men are supposed to be a certain way, and when I see another man acting that way at work, then I think, okay, that's what he's supposed to be doing. So he's successful because he's aggressive, right? But when I see a woman doing it, I think a different thing because, well, not me, but I'm just saying that this is the perception. And this is historically one reason for the glass ceiling is that when a woman acts that same exact way, like really aggressive, like go getter, this is what I want. And, I'm going to call out people. I might be cutthroat. That's perceived as her being a bitch. And she's somebody that you don't want to be around. She's a backstabber, right? And so it's more difficult for women to earn respect by using those methods. Again, that's not so bad now, but there was a reason for the glass ceiling and why it took so long for there to sort of be a level of equality here, because the same actions are perceived differently. And so that's really what I mean. When we talk about when is it okay to be a jerk and what constitutes being a jerk, right? Well, what society perceives matters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I still don't know if I'm bored with it. And again, I don't, I'm not saying there isn't sexism because, for instance, at the bank, I saw a lot of sexism, right? As far as like, say, older men being weird and pervy towards some of our colleagues, and kind of being a little bit definitely on the creepy side, but also being sexist, kind of saying this weird stuff. I've seen it at previous jobs, but I haven't seen so much in terms of, say, women in leadership positions. Maybe a little bit, but it's been, in my opinion, more of a side effect of, or more of a subset of just creepy old, sexist white men. Or why did I say white men? Oh, well, yeah, everyone in New
Yeah,
Hampshire
but
is
you have
white.
to remember that those women are already in positions of power. So they already had to overcome these stereotypes. I mean, sometimes they get treated that way when they're in power as a response to what they're saying, but more often than not, this is when women are trying to break from being at the employee level to being in a position of power is when this is really happening, when their actions are being perceived differently and they're not perceived as people who are ready for leadership because the actions that men take that they're like, whoa, this person's a go-getter, they're going to make a good leader, right? They get promoted faster because the women who do these same things are perceived as either like more emotional or maybe they're unstable and they might be jerks. So we don't want them in leadership positions. So it's happening more often at the lower levels.
I'm not really see again. I don't want to just like say. like disagree because it's like ultimately there's an empirical sort of thing there. Like I'm sure there's studies on the matter, and that would be open to changing my mind, but it's like there's a conclusion there, and then like if I state anything to the opposite, then it's just conclusion gets put back onto the playing field, and I can't fight against a conclusion because when it comes down to subjectivity, you can always inject that subjectivity or that aspect of some ingrained fire, say perception that's there, that it's affecting everything, and this is what it's causing. The people who are there are only overcoming it, and so on and so forth. You can kind of always inject it into it, no matter where it goes. So there has to be some like actual real world measurement that we can have there, and it's got to be I don't know, because I've seen plenty of female bosses everywhere, and a lot of times the females get promoted more than the males. I mean, I've seen that. So
Well, again, there are statistics out there that support a lot of this, but I don't know them off the top of my head. And there are more female bosses now because we've recognized these problems. But that's precisely my point, is that we actually go out of our way to intentionally promote women now because we recognize that we had this sort of unconscious bias. It's the same thing with racism, although there's a lot more complexity there than there is with, the issue that we're talking about. So I certainly don't want to conflate the two, but implicit bias and racism works the exact same way. And we recognize that that exists now. So we have diversity programs that sort of work to intentionally correct that course. And what the hope is that over the course of several generations that would be fixed. Racism isn't a problem that we're going to fix tomorrow just because we recognize it. But what we try to do is like create diversity programs, education, show diversity in TV shows. And so that way we subconsciously kind of brainwash the younger generations so that they're not racist when they grow up. Right. And so luckily, as I mentioned before, our generation is really the first one to not really be sexist. I mean, there are some people in our generation that are sexist, but a lot of people 30 and younger just really aren't sexist because it started getting phased out in the 1960s and beyond. So we've already made a lot of progress on that. So it's not, in a way, it's not surprising that you don't perceive it as often. But maybe it was because I worked in a kitchen that was all men, and a lot of them were sexist. So I've had a lot of exposure to this, but it's definitely a thing that exists.
I'm not doubting it exists, especially if it's a high pressure area. So like in a lot of corporate things, like this is where part of my skepticism comes to, because all those features that you mentioned that are, say, how men are perceived, or so on and so forth, those are just kind of standard features of testosterone, and men, as we all know, have more testosterone than women. It's almost like 2 or 3 times the amount. It's like a crazy amount, and testosterone is very, very linked with all those things: aggression, and also drive. It's one reason why people who play competitive sports will take steroids, because it increases their drive and the competition, that aggression, that kind of go get it. And there's lots of other different effects of, say, increased testosterone that will affect behavior. And a lot of those are very successful in the business world, especially the corporate world, because in the corporate world, you have to be, say, very cutthroat and very, aggressive. So, like, I don't think it's surprising that people who have, say, more aggressive tendencies, or people who tend to have a greater amount of testosterone, I think they're probably correlated there, to be honest. But I think those people will tend to rise to the top just because that's how the system's kind of set up. Whether that's good or bad, that's another question. But I think that a lot of the women you see who rise to the top in that same way, they're on just that same level of aggression. Like, I've seen some corporate women who, like, they are very, very aggressive, and it's not a bad thing. I kind of respect them for that. I like how they kind of just go after it, and kind of they can handle anybody. There's actually that lady, what's her name? I forget her name, but have you seen the new Trump press secretary?
Yeah, I'm aware of her.
You like see her deal with the press, and whether you agree or disagree with Trump, who cares? But the way that she handles the press and these kind of aggressive questions, whether you agree or disagree, the questions are definitely aggressive and hard to answer. The way she handles people and stuff is just incredible. Like, she is like top of the game. Like, And how she got there, I mean, some people like just look at her and say, "Oh, she's got good looks," and that's very true too. But she got there because of competency. She is like a beast. Like if she was on the other side, that would be kind of scary too. Like whoever she's fighting for, like you want her on your side because she's like, I don't know, a bit of a beast.
Yeah, but see, that's kind of my point, is that people would even say that she got there because of her looks. And I agree, she got there because of her competency. And you mentioned our former boss earlier. I have the same opinion about her, that she's very good at her job. She's extremely proficient, genuinely nice person, but you don't want to cross her because she's ambitious and she has certain career aspirations. And you can't blame her for that. So again, I think we're both on the same page that neither of us have these sort of thoughts, that there's any differentiation between ambitions of men or women. But there are people out there who think that. Even just looking at the customers that come into the bank and automatically come up to me and say, start talking to me and asking me things as if I'm the manager. And granted, I am now, but this happened long before I was the manager. And when the manager was a female, they would always come to me. Sometimes they would even come up to the female manager and say, "Can I speak with the manager?" and then look at me. So like, there's just this assumption automatically that because maybe I carry myself a certain way, because I speak a certain way, that I must be in a position of power. But that's not necessarily true. And you're right. It's almost always older folks. And again, that goes back to what I was saying, is that this is a mentality that thankfully is being phased out.
I'm going to make a snide remark here. I mean, at least maybe the manager before this one, but the one who we shared together, I think people were coming up to you and thinking she was not the manager because she didn't really know what she was doing. And I think she always had that, look on her face. That's true. She's like, "Oh God, please don't ask me any questions."
But to be fair, they didn't know that.
True.
Yeah. But yeah. Well, anyway, I know we have to wrap this up, but yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So our current, or not our current, our previous boss, the head boss that we had, I think people would see her and just assume she was the manager just because the way she looks and carries herself. Like she looks like a boss. And same with her boss. Like they both look like bosses. Like if you see them kind of walk in, you kind of like see that look. Or the place we're working, like the general building, there was a new manager put in there for the Hannaford. And like the day she walked in, I knew she was the boss just because the way she was walking. I mean, number one, she had like these, I don't know why it's a stereotype, but like, like high ranking bosses will always have like these high heels that always make lots of noise. But she had those high heels that made a lot of noise, and she's walking around like, oh, she must be a new boss or like some big up corporate executive. Like it just kind of like they had that kind of vibe. And same with guys when walk in. Like the first time I started working at this one place, I didn't know this guy was the boss, but I'm like, yep, he runs this. He just had that kind of look to him, and I think people would say that of the head boss at where we used to work or where I used to work.
Any guy that's wearing wingtips, for instance, like he's either the boss or just a huge douche, or possibly both.
Did I wear wingtips?
I don't know. Did you?
I think you're slighting me. Oh shit! Ouch.
Yeah.
So I think the conclusion of this is sexism bad, racism bad. Being a jerk, good.
Sometimes.
Right?
So never. Sometimes you just shouldn't be a jerk.
Okay. Always
like
be a
if
jerk.
Your girlfriend asks you, "Does this dress make me look fat?" Probably not a good idea to be a jerk then.
So
right, but
be honest.
In a lot of cases, it is good.
If my girlfriend,
you know what? We have a whole other podcast about that. If anybody wants to check it out, you can. I'm not going to get into this with you again here because you already know I disagree.
About girlfriends being fat?
About the dress thing. We did a whole other podcast about whether it's okay to lie. And this whole topic was on there about this specific example because I brought it up. Remember?
That's right.
And you already know we disagree on this one.
You said she did look fat.
No. Well, I said if she looks fat, you wouldn't say it. You would say, but you wouldn't not say it, right? Because you don't want to lie. But what you say is, I think you look really beautiful anyway, no
Well,
matter what you wear.
thank you,
Right?
Patrick.
That avoids the weight
You
question
know,
altogether.
I really appreciate that compliment there you gave to me.
Classic misdirection. Yeah.
Okay, so next time on Does Anything Matter, we find out if she actually does look fat or not.